Anyway, Dave, as quickly as possible, actually I think I've known Dave for about 20 years. He was one of Michigan's top environmentalists for many years, known primarily now for his Great Lakes advocacy. He served in numerous advisory capacities. He's now the policy advisor for the International Joint Commission. They oversee environmental issues that are shared between the U.S. and Canada. He's author of Ruin and Recovery, the only environmental history of the state of Michigan, and numerous other books. You can see them in the back. And he's going to share his unique perspective, and he's going to say tell us why this project is important to our community, but also on a larger geographic level. So with that, if you want to add anything, Dave, you are welcome to get started.
Okay, thank you. Let me pop up my little picture show here. This is just advanced right there.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. It's so great to be here. I'm so pleased that so many of you came out on a rather challenging night. I'm honored and I'm flattered, and I'm also honored on behalf of this project because I think it shows you have an interest not so much in Dave Dempsey, but in White Lake's environmental history. First thing I want to say is I want to compliment this community on a terrific library. I looked around briefly, and I'm just amazed by this resource that you have here. It shows a real commitment to culture and literacy. It's something that every community should have and should be as proud of as you are. This is an amazing place to be, so I'm honored to be here tonight. I also want to commend the community for the White Lake Environmental History Project. You may well be the only community in the state, and the first, I hope, of many, who are trying to document and tell the story of the environmental history of the area. I'll talk to you a little bit later about why environmental history is important, but I just think it's something precious here for White Lake to be a pioneer in environmental history at the community level. And hopefully you'll excuse my voice tonight because I have a bit of a cold. To me, environmental history is a history of hope. You'll be seeing, and you'll already see one right now, you'll be seeing some pictures of what I would call environmental carnage that have happened over the years, some very grim things that we've done to our environment. But the lesson of the history that I've researched, and I think you'll be researching here in this community, is that things come back. People take initiatives. They clean up what messes exist, and they restore, and in some cases can even bring back and improve upon the beauty that was there before. So environmental history is not a story of destruction, it's a story of restoration and hope. What I wanted to do first is walk you through a very quick picture show about Michigan's environmental history so you can see where you might fit in as a community. I remember after publishing Ruin and Recovery in 2001, giving a talk like this to a college audience, and I showed a picture just like this. And this is the North Woods, what was left of the North Woods of Michigan in the early 1900s. Almost every single acre of marketable timber from Clare northward across the Upper Peninsula was logged and left to slash and burn afterwards. And one of the students in the audience said, until I heard you give this speech, I thought those trees in the northern Lower Peninsula had always been there. I thought they were just there for time immemorial. And I said, no, actually what happened is they were all chopped down. There were murderous forest fires that crossed Michigan and killed hundreds of people. And then citizens came together and replanted those trees and created this forest that you think is the primeval forest. And that's sort of, to me, one of the points of having environmental history stories told. We don't understand things that happened long ago that affect our lives today. In 1949, so many ducks died because of an oil spill on the Detroit River that sportsmen took thousands of them to Lansing and dumped them on the sidewalk leading to the Capitol and paraded state legislators by them to see how bad pollution had become in Michigan. That's on the left there is the governor of Michigan at the time, Kim Sigler, being shown what was going on in the Detroit River. That was 1949, and it was many years later, actually, before the river was cleaned up. This is a picture from Life magazine in 1954, and it's entitled 4 Acres of Dead Carp on the Kalamazoo. The Kalamazoo River was a river that was pretty much considered an industrial sewer for many, many years. It was used by the paper industry and led to massive contamination. I want to just read a little bit of a story about the Kalamazoo from Ruin and Recovery. To a young man raised among the usually clear-flowing streams of Kansas, the sight of Portage Creek in southwest Michigan during the middle 1960s was startling. It looked like a blueberry milkshake, John Hesse thought. It was that color, but not quite the thickness of a shake, he remembered years later. For decades, the paper industry had used the creek, a major tributary of the Kalamazoo River, as its sewer. Coupling its waste with the city's poorly treated sewage, untreated waste from the recycling and de-inking of paper extinguished almost all aquatic life for miles downstream in the river. It was almost impossible to find fish. Sludge worms, considered pollution tolerant, were almost the only aquatic life to survive. Counting the number of sludge worms in a square foot of sample of mud along the riverbank was one of his more unpleasant jobs. Fish were not the only sufferers, however. One day, John Hesse and his other researchers washed themselves with germicidal soap after any contact with the river to prevent the possibility from infection from poorly treated human waste that were dumped into the river. But he broke the rules at least once. On a steamy day, he jumped from a boat and swam across Allegan Lake. He was hospitalized with skin infections. Examining the staggeringly high E. coli bacteria counts in the river later, he was astonished. So imagine a day in Michigan when our water resources, which we consider now to be our prize, were actually a source of disease and infection to the casual swimmer. Does anybody have any idea what river this is that's on fire? Cuyahoga, yes. The Cuyahoga River became the poster child for pollution in America back in 1969 when Life magazine published a picture just like this. The Cuyahoga was the river that empties out into Lake Erie at Cleveland and carried oil, chemicals, and debris, and regularly burned. It became almost a fact of life, a routine matter to see the river catch on fire. But in 1969, two things were different. Life magazine was there to record it and make it a national story, and the public was finally awakening to the threat of pollution and was stirred to action by scenes of rivers catching on fire. And this particular fire on the Cuyahoga in 1969 is credited with helping create the national movement that led to the Clean Water Act in 1972. Michigan had a chemical contamination issue of its own back in the mid-1970s. Anybody who lived in Michigan in 1973, and I count myself among them, and who ate meat or drank milk has a residue in their bodies called polybrominated biphenyls, or PBB. There was an industrial accident in which flame retardant and cattle feed were mixed, and of course the flame retardant was fed to the cattle and contaminated the food chain, so it led to an enormous contamination of the human population of Michigan. 9 million Michiganians were poisoned. To what end we still don't know because the studies have still not been completed, but we do know that there have been some health effects. To control the contamination, Michigan paid farmers and slaughtered their cows and buried them in a giant landfill near Mayo, Michigan. We believed in chemicals back in those days. DDT was considered a miracle chemical back after World War II. You may know it was used in World War II to control lice on soldiers in the South Pacific. When the war ended, the chemical manufacturers wanted to find uses at home so they could continue to make profits and marketed it as a sure-all cure for any insect in the house or outside the house. But we found within 20 years of their widespread use of this chemical that it also led to the die-off of many of our iconic species, including the bald eagle. And DDT was banned in 1972. Michigan was the first state to take strong action against DDT in 1969. Hearing some of these stories about industrial pollution, there's a tendency, I think, to believe that there's sort of a white hat versus bad hat thing where we had crooks and we had heroes. So much of what we did to our forests, what we did to our lakes and rivers and our other resources was not done intentionally by outlaws, but by people who were simply not thinking of the future or thinking ahead in the consequences of their actions. And as I'll be discussing in a minute, so environmental history really is not about trying to point fingers of blame, but trying to understand the mentality that led us to make some of these great mistakes. Where does the hope begin? Well, the hope begins with individual citizens who took action in their own time to try to restore the environment. Charles Garfield is probably one of the least known conservation heroes of Michigan. He was a Grand Rapids banker who, around the turn of the last century, in 1900, became a crusader on his own time to convince the state of Michigan to take some of the burned over lands of northern Michigan and invest public dollars in planting trees and regrowing the forests of Michigan. He started very small. He was not very successful at first because the state did not see it as its business to be in the job of managing or creating forests. But through persistence and public education, this man was able to convince the legislature in 1901 to create the first state forest reserve, which was about 35,000 acres. Today, Michigan has a state forest system of about 4 million acres. It's the largest state forest system east of the Mississippi, and largely the result of this man's pioneering advocacy, his public education. He lobbied in Lansing as an unpaid lobbyist, but his number one activity was to be a spokesperson. He published pamphlets, he gave speeches around the state. He talked up the value of forests, not as something for his own generation or even for his children, but for his grandchildren. And so we're beneficiaries of that today. Now this character is Genevieve Gillette. Genevieve Gillette was a volunteer who worked for 60 years to promote Michigan's state park system and also played a key role in the creation of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Park. Like many environmentalists that I've come across both in my research and in my career, she's an unusual person. She was very loud, very boisterous, very stubborn, very persistent. Some would say even obnoxious. And yet she did so much good for our state. And she had a lot of guts, too. Just want to read one little excerpt of something that happened to her as she was crusading for Sleeping Bear Dunes. Today, we tend to think of Sleeping Bear Dunes and other national parks as valuable assets that there's no question about, that we all think are beautiful and valuable. But there was an enormous fight over whether or not to create Sleeping Bear Dunes National Park because it was considered a land grab by the federal government, taking away private property and turning it into a playground for the public. And so in the community where the fight was held, which was in Glen Arbor, Genevieve Gillette was asked by the National Park Service to be the lone citizen who would actually go up there and speak in an auditorium of 400 people who were otherwise opposed to the park. And she took that on with no great joy, but with a sense of duty. She got up in her speech, talked about the beautiful features of the lakeshore and said, "National parks provide us recreation in its fullest sense, pleasure as well as relaxation, development of spiritual qualities, and even for the everyday visitor, an appreciation and understanding of the natural phenomena and forces of nature. It has been said that every national park is an outdoor university where people can become acquainted with undisturbed plant and animal life, observe the wonders of Earth's formation even throughout its millions of years. Outstanding opportunities for this sort of thing you have seen today in the Sleeping Bear country." Then she went on to say something a little bit more controversial. She said she was tired of hearing people talk about property owners' rights. "On this 4th of July here at this subcommittee hearing, I must say that all this talk about property rights is now worn pretty threadbare." This statement, reported one local newspaper, drew an unbelieving gasp from the audience. Another paper editorialized a few days later, "With that statement, Miss Gillette, an Ann Arbor resident who describes herself as an architect, dismissed one of the basic tenets of American life, the right to hold property against arbitrary seizure or limitations by governments. Fortunately, few of the others who testified at Frankfurt on July 4th in favor of a recreation area were so ready to brush aside the question of property rights." Genevieve was not pleased about becoming a symbol of government meddling in private lives and later said, "When I walked out of that school at noon when the meeting was over, I had many good friends who lined up on either side of the sidewalk and turned their backs on me." So there is a lonely spokesperson, perhaps speaking a little bit too bluntly, but in the right cause in favor of Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. And today that's considered the #1 destination park in America, according to a recent survey. I just want to briefly mention another woman who's a friend of mine named Joan Wolfe, who lives in Frankfurt. She was the founder of the West Michigan Environmental Action Council in 1966, and I would consider her to be the the mother of the Michigan environmental movement. She was responsible as a citizen advocate, again, mostly unpaid as a volunteer, for getting the state to pass some of its landmark environmental laws back in the 1960s and 70s. Those would include the Michigan Environmental Protection Act, which was considered the most important milestone environmental law for a state at that time. And another favorite of mine, former Governor William G. Milliken. Governor Milliken, I think, is known for many things beyond his environmental protection. He served as the longest serving governor of Michigan from 1969 to 1982 and is known for so many things, but one of the things that I think we must remember him for is his contribution to Michigan's environment. He was courageous in the defense of conservation. The other three people I've shown you who were activists were citizen activists, and I reserve very few special places for politicians in environmental history as leaders. And the one place that I can think of goes to Governor William G. Milliken. You may recall, and I certainly recall, back in the late 1960s, it was true to some extent in parts of Lake Michigan. It was certainly true in Lake Erie that the lake was choked with algae because of phosphorus. The number one culprit identified by scientists as causing the phosphorus was laundry detergent. And so the scientists in the Michigan Department of Natural Resources prescribed a reduction in phosphorus in detergent as the number one way to clean up Lakes Michigan and Erie. Well, that was science. Then there's politics. The politics is that Michigan had a couple of companies that produced phosphorus-containing detergent and had no interest in changing their product formulation in order to help the Great Lakes. One of those companies, I guess I can name it now, is the Amway Corporation. And they are a leading donor to the party that the Governor Milliken belonged to. And they went to the governor and said, kill this idea. This is going to cost us money and drive jobs from Michigan. And he said, we're going ahead with this. This is good for the Great Lakes. Whatever else happens, I want the Great Lakes to be protected. And so that's, to me, an inspirational story of a politician doing the right thing for the environment. So I've just shown you pictures of four people that I call builders, people who built an environment that we now benefit from, and you can make a couple of observations about them. Generally, it was the citizens leading the leaders. It wasn't the politicians coming down from on high with their pronouncements and making things better. It was citizens agitating, testifying, organizing, preaching, educating, writing, and talking to their neighbors about the benefits of a better environment. And probably the most important quality that they all had was persistence, the ability to stick with the battle for many years. Charles Garfield, who was the forestry builder, spent 20 unsuccessful years trying to convince the legislature to do something to create a state forest before he first succeeded. So he was a very persistent man. I just wanted to mention a couple of the other battles that we won back in the 60s and 70s. One of my favorites is the fight to preserve the Estevan pines, which is one of the few last stands of old-growth white pine in Michigan. We used to have millions of acres of white pine that stood over 100 feet tall across the state, all logged. One little piece of several remains in the Upper Peninsula was saved by a group called the Michigan Nature Association in 1969, which raised $37,000 to buy the land. If you go up there, you can actually be a real true tree hugger, as I've been, and put your arms around some of these major trees and not quite get all the way around. Sleeping Bear Dunes, I mentioned. And here's the story of what happened when Michigan and other states banned phosphorus in laundry detergent. We had a target loading that's set by the International Joint Commission to achieve a reduction of algae, and it was achieved within 7 years of the initial ban on phosphorus in detergent. So if you think actions by governments cannot make a difference, this is proof to the contrary. And the Kirtland warbler is another example of tremendous sustained recovery. We were down to less than 100 breeding pairs of Kirtland warblers in the early 1980s, and through a combination of government and private efforts, we now have well over 1,000 breeding pairs, several thousand actually, in Michigan as a result of citizen and government efforts. So when I say environmental history is a history of hope, that's what I'm talking about. I always want to show this slide too, I don't know why. Maybe a little bit more appropriate now with the lake levels going down. But actually, it's not those guys that are causing the problem. So let me just talk a little bit more generally about environmental history, and then we can talk together. what really is environmental history? I just want to answer that question. What is it not? To me, and to others, it's a branch of history just like any other branch. It has, you might think of political history, economic history, or military history. We also now have environmental history. It's a history of our relationship to the natural world, how we consider it, how we treat it, what our policies are toward it, and what we plan for it. There are professional journals now dedicated to environmental history. It's considered a science. And to me, it's just as entertaining as any other branch of history. And I'm a big fan of Michigan history, a fan of Civil War history, a fan of presidential history. Environmental history is not a bunch of facts and figures. I threw a couple at you, but I tried to emphasize the people. Environmental history is storytelling. It's learning the stories and telling the stories of people who have done things for the environment or to the environment. And that's why I'm very pleased, as Tanya mentioned, that your White Lake Environmental History Project has oral histories. That's where you really get at the meat of what environmental history is. What was the experience people had in seeing pollution and helping get it cleaned up? It's also, I think, revealing and instructional. It tells us a lot about who we are as a people and what motivates us to do things for and against the environment. Environmental history is not a matter of digging up dirt. It's not looking for the bad things that happen so that we can blame culprits and identify outlaws. It's about telling the good and the bad. And I hope that as this project proceeds, that's the commitment that you continue to keep. You'll be looking at both the good things that happen, the bad things that happen, and particularly now the recovery that we're enjoying. Why is environmental history important to this particular community of White Lake? Well, you can't really appreciate what you've got until you know where you've been. I dare say there are probably many people who come here to visit now in the summertime who have no idea of the history of Hooker Chemical or of the lumbering era and what it did to the trees and the forests and the watersheds of this area. Some of us who are a little older, like me, I'm 29 and I remember things, do remember Hooker Chemical, but we may think everybody else does, but it's just not true. So it's important to preserve the memory of what was done to harm the environment of this community so that people in the future coming after us will appreciate what was done to restore it. Environmental history for White Lake, to me, is also part of your community heritage. It's just as important as learning about the lumberjacks or anybody else who operated businesses here. It's part of the heritage of your history. The right stories, and I'm sure you're collecting those, are also stories that will delight and entertain people and be a valuable resource in that regard. It's also important that White Lake tell its environmental history because you are one of the communities setting a tone in the Great Lakes. White Lake was identified as one of 43 so-called areas of concern or toxic hotspots back in the mid-1980s by the International Joint Commission in the U.S. and Canada. So White Lake is a microcosm of the story of the degradation and the recovery of the Great Lakes. And I'm pleased to say, based on what I've learned over recent months and what I learned today previously at a meeting, that you are making great progress toward becoming one of the first areas of concern to be removed from the list. There's only been 2 out of the 43 on the U.S. side that have been delisted, and this community may be the 3rd or 4th, which would make it a national success story. So just as the Hooker Chemical contamination was something that was on the CBS Evening News and in Life magazine 50 years ago, 40 years ago, so might your recovery become part of a national story as well. I want to talk a little bit about some lessons that I've learned from environmental history. And I throw these out to you as lessons and questions for you to ponder as you think about environmental history. First, we seem to go through cycles of exploitation and restoration. Michigan has been through at least 3 such cycles, or is in the midst, I would say right now, of its 3rd cycle. The first cycle was the wanton logging and destruction of our fish and game in the 1800s. The mandate and the motivation for everybody was to take what they could get and get out as fast as they could, make as much money as they could. Then came the conservation era following that, where people like Charles Garfield and others championed the idea of restoring and healing the land and bringing back those resources. Then we had what I would call the 2nd cycle, which was the pollution era, where it was considered acceptable to throw one's waste anywhere you wanted. it was actually literally considered state policy that the Great Lakes were so big you could throw as much pollution as you wanted into them and it would not harm them. We know much better now, but at the time, that was the ethic. And then, of course, we have spent the last 40 years restoring and cleaning up the Great Lakes. Now the question is, what are we doing with our land? We're treating our land resources as something that we can develop and throw away, destroy wetlands, and turn them into other non-productive uses, and that's something that we have to think about. Can we get past the cyclical nature of environmental history, or can we maintain sort of more of a steady approach to managing our resources? We also run up against this idea that in America that we have limitless resources, that our resources are inexhaustible. And the inexhaustible is the word that was actually applied to Michigan's forests in the 1800s. The logging industry said it would take 500 years to log Michigan's trees because there were so many of them. It took actually about 40 years to log the entire state. We do not see inexhaustible resources when we compare human appetite for them. It was once thought that Earth's atmosphere was so big that human activity could not influence it. We know that's not true, so we need to get past this idea of inexhaustible resources. A major, and this is where the hope comes back in, the major theme, of course, that I found is that individuals make an enormous difference in restoring the environment. The ones that are mentioned in Ruin and Recovery that I've shown you, and there's many other names, are people who generally worked at the state level and are famous for having changed state policies. I could fill a library, maybe this library, full of books with individuals who in community levels across the state have done just the same thing at their level. There are stories beyond numbering of people who have taken community situations that were dire with their environment and restored everything from a small wetland to an enormous watershed. People do make the difference, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. And finally, I just want to give you a few thoughts on the White Lake project moving forward. As I said before, excuse me, tell the whole story. Tell the good and the bad. There's plenty of things we need to be sorry about that happened in White Lake. People who did things that they shouldn't have. We also have to remember the same industries that we now blame for the pollution that caused so much degradation were considered community friends at the time. They created jobs. They brought prosperity for a time. Unfortunately, they stuck many of us with the bill, but they were not considered bad at the time. They were considered contributors to the community. Tell that whole story. It's very complex, and it needs to be explained in a complex fashion. I would like you to work with schools as much as you can. I think it's a way of, environmental history is a way of bringing alive much of the subject matter that kids are mandated to learn today. Anything from chemistry and biology to government can be taught through learning about local environmental history and how things have changed over the years. Perhaps most importantly, document what's happening today. This is history being made right now, and you may not think it's very exciting or very important, but the steps that are being taken by the community and the White Lake Public Advisory Council to delist this area of concern and to build what I hope will be a lasting framework of protection for White Lake and the White Lake watershed. This is something that historians will want to know about in 30, 40, 50 years. Keep the documents, restore and maintain what you have so that people can benefit from those lessons in the future. I would like to see White Lake become sort of a chapter 1 of a book about the restoration of watersheds across Michigan, and you can help tell that story if you preserve that history. So let me just close by saying that I appreciate this community's commitment to environmental history. I commend you for this project. I'm very excited about the potential for it to become a model for the Great Lakes region and to help people who come after us understand not just the bad things that have happened to our environment, but the hope and opportunity that awaits when we band together as citizens. Thank you very much. Has anybody got an environmental history story they can tell right now about White Lake? Let's hear a story.
I think, between my wife and myself, we did a lot of battling companies over the years. The main goal was always to try try and clean it up and to make sure that in the future it wasn't a mess. The DuPont, for example, which always tends to slide under the radar, had a pipeline going directly into Lake Michigan. It still does. It still has a permit to dump. And they still do. Not as serious as where you take a boat and watch it bubble up out of the lake. But they also had trouble occasionally with the lake being rough, the pipeline not working. So they put a valve over the creek and opened the valve when it got too rough. And it killed everything in the creek. The state of Michigan at that time fined them $500. So eventually, the state said you can't have the valve over the creek. So surreptitiously, some of my friends took a photo. They moved the valve to put a fire hose back into the creek and move the valve up the creek, up the pipeline. We had gone to, we had these photos, it was kind of funny, we went to the manager and said, what are you guys doing? And he brought out his corporate policies and we would never do it. Then we showed him the photos and the change was tune that serious than what we needed to do.
So you solve that problem through dialogue? That's an interesting approach. Doesn't always take confrontation or demonstration, huh?
I heard a story about you had to leave your job teaching
I'll get
to
married.
bail out a family member from jail.
Well, close.
I thought that's fair.
Well, what happened was that when the trucks were coming from Berlin Faro to dump in the Hooker chemical site, Mary had said, well, I'm going to stand in front of the trucks. And she had called the state police and everything and said, this is what's going to happen. So, unbeknownst to me, when I get home, I picked the girls up. At that time, they were elementary, and they were over at the Catholic school for CCD. So I go in, and my younger daughter says to me, well, is Mom in jail tonight? None looked at me like, you were expecting that? But what happened was a former judge, Ralph Rose, said, do you mind if I get arrested instead? So he stood in front of the truck, stopped it for a while, and the state police arrested him, and they were just going to put him in the front. He said, no, you put me like a regular arrestee or whatever. And put him in the bag. So he ended up, I think, serving 100 hours in community service for locking.
What year would this have been, roughly?
Oh,
During the cleanup, correct? 80, 81?
yeah, it would have been during the cleanup because remember the trucks were coming from Berlin Faro after the state of Michigan said they would never put anything else in there other than Hooker. But they had a problem with the old Berlin and Faro site. And also remember the first time the trucks came, they got lost, went out the Fruitvale Road all the way to the end, and had a hard time turning around and getting back up out of there. Again, a little mess.
Well, what was in the trucks, or why stop the trucks? What was in the truck? What were they doing? Why were the trucks bringing something in or out? Or
Yeah, there was mainly, Berlin and Faro was a dump site for the auto industry primarily.
where was that?
By Flint?
By Flint. And they had paint residues and whatever. And the state had an issue there. And they needed a place to put it, even though they said initially we would not use the Hooker dump site for anything but the Hooker chemical stuff. Well, they had cut a deal somehow.
So they bring paint there in from Flint or something deeper.
Toxic waste from the Berlin and Faro. And there's another interesting story with Chuck Berlin. Walking away from that and then applying for another dump site permit and getting it.
Well, and for those who who don't know, it was probably 1981 that there was a cleanup of the site, and all of the, the barrels and waste and things were to be put in a vault. There's actually a marble tombstone there with the names of the chemicals and hexachlorocyclopentadiene, there. And I'm not sure, but it seems like they may have even made some kind of connection between the chemical Berlin and Farrell as far as, being able to take the waste. I'm not sure.
There was some sort of
reasoning.
legal rumble jungle at the time.
Well, and then the other piece of that story is that there was quite a bit of concern among community members that they didn't put everything in the vault, and they did not. And so in the mid-90s, the EPA came back and ordered an additional cleanup and investigated those areas that were called no-man's land, and those areas were excavated and put in the vault, or, not in the vault, they were taken care of. So even when you get a cleanup, you may not get a total cleanup.
And lessons were learned in the cleanup. The fine that they gave to Hooker, $1 million, and Mary and Frank Kelly were smiling and handing the big check. And it went to the general fund of the state and was not used for the cleanup here.
Or for any reparations.
Right. And even, at least the initial fine a long time ago, the $300,000 ended up with the municipal marina.
The municipal marina was dealt with some of those storms, so a legacy of.
So I haven't picketed anybody for quite a while.
Don't need to anymore. It's all good, right?
I didn't go to Lansing for right to work.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
One industry that hasn't been mentioned, and I'd like a little bit of your input, is the farming industry.
Is the farming industry? What kind of thoughts do you have about that?
In regard to the pollution from the farming industry currently now, as far as being an industry, food production, we talk about chemical, factories and auto industries and stuff like that, but it seems like a lot of our issues now could be, coming from away from us through that.
Factory farms, just as a case in point, if you're not familiar with it, in my little job as a county commissioner, I'm involved with health department issues. Flower Creek, that flows through Minor Park, has high E. coli counts, primarily from runoff from manure spreading on farm fields in that area. And that's not the chemical, but that's just animal waste on the field, too close to the stream. Factory farms, some regulation now, but controlling their waste has been an issue in the state of Michigan for a while. Getting permits, they didn't have to have a permit unless they were actually polluting something. I'm not sure where that legislation's at anymore.
We have an issue with farms that relates to algae too, which is phosphorus runoff from fertilizers. I mentioned the recovery of Lake Erie and Lake Michigan, especially Lake Erie, from the reduction in phosphorus into laundry detergents. But 2 years ago, Lake Erie had the worst algae blooms it's ever had, and those are believed to have been the result of a massive phosphorus fertilizer runoff from farms in Ohio and southeast Michigan. There happened to be record rains at the very time that the fertilizers were applied, and so that ran off into Lake Erie and created a so-called dead zone that occupied the western half of the lake. Now last year, to the contrary, it was a very dry spring, and the algae bloom was almost nil in western Lake Erie. But you may have heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which also relates to over enrichment of the Mississippi River with farm fertilizers. I would personally say fertilizers are a greater farm pollutant issue right now than chemicals, although you could make a case for both. But what we have to do is figure out ways to make it economical and logical for farmers to apply less fertilizer. Right now, all the incentives are not only to apply as much fertilizer as possible, but to plant right up to the edge of the water because the commodity prices are so high. So the economics, what they mandate for farmers. Put excess phosphorus on the fertilizer. Phosphorus fertilizer on the land. So that is a concern. I don't know what, I haven't heard much about it being an issue in this part of the state, though.
Well, the county did move forward and introduce a ban on lawn fertilizer, including phosphorus. And I think the state of Michigan has now moved forward.
I think the state of Michigan preempted that, so that the county ban is not really legal, but there is a state ban, I think. It was about 5 years ago or something.
And that was helpful too, and then there again is the education, make sure that you don't have your lawn mowed right up to the edge of the water, and you're not putting a whole lot of fertilizer on it, it runs off every time it rains.
Are there other hot spots in Michigan?
Yes, there are. There were initially 14, I believe, Tanya. And several of them we share with Canada, such as the Detroit River, the St. Mary's River, and I'm trying to think of some of the other examples. There's several in every place. Kalamazoo River, which I mentioned, is actually a 40-mile-long Superfund site as well because of all the PCB waste that went into it.
River Rouge.
St. Clair River.
Raisin, Rouge River.
Right. Muskegon Lake, of course, is an area of concern as well, so that's the nearest to White Lake.
Several in the UP.
So we have fully 1/3 of the areas of concern in Michigan, but of course, Michigan is the Great Lakes state. We're at the heart of the basin too. Yes, in the back?
Oh, I was just saying, it's important too, I think, to get your local government leaders support. You know, when Whitehall City Council got behind the tannery cleanup, I mean, that made a big difference. And they hired an environmental attorney to take the cause and support it financially, and things changed.
I wonder how that was accomplished. How was the city council swayed to become that aggressive?
Good
Citizens.
Good place to look is the Norm Allman video. When Dave is done and talking and doing some signing, I'll put one of the videos up. The Norm Allman, he talks about.
And
all
city
that.
manager, I think.
Yeah,
who
Jerry Hamming.
took the cause to the council.
You can have a drastic change just with the change in staff at city and elected officials where they could end up on the other side of, trying to help the polluting industry.
I was just going to say something about the contamination at Booker. At one point, having the Love Canal event also focused on the White Lake area. And we had contacted the folks in New York and their issues and how it affected here as well, putting us in a national stage.
You work with those activists to team up to get media attention?
Right.
Although-
Lois came.
Lois Gibbs, although they tended to get
They got more,
more overall publicity.
but it brought a focus on
Yeah.
White Lake as well, simply because of the Booker issue.
Any other questions for Dave? And if not, Dave, go ahead.
Dave, you mentioned the reforestation of northern Michigan,
Right.
which to a large extent is oak and maple, et cetera. How did that get back in there? It just didn't seem, that wasn't that natural. I mean, people don't seem to plant those kind of trees around.
There's a lot of hardwood in Upper Michigan, Lower Michigan, so I guess I'm not exactly sure.
But if it was reforested, you said people came out and planted all those, or a lot of those trees.
Right. Yeah, the state tree farms have been used to replant all across northern Michigan for upwards of 50 years. I think most of them gone now. Yeah.
want to thank you for coming, and make sure you take a look at the books in the back, and we'll be able to hang on to Dave here for a little while before he's got to hit the snow-covered roads, but thank you very much for coming, and look for more from us, and certainly hopefully you can find a way to participate in the projects. So be safe driving
Yes,
home.
thank you. Be safe driving. Well, appreciate your interest in environmental.
And please have some of the snacks here. The library staff doesn't like it when they have to eat the leftovers, I've heard. Oh, those are on the